The year was 370 AD, and along the frozen banks of the Volga River, a people unlike any the Romans or Germanic tribes had ever encountered were about to reshape the destiny of Europe. They came from the east, riding horses that seemed welded to their bodies, carrying bows that could kill at distances no European warrior thought possible, moving with a speed that defied comprehension. They were the Huns, and within decades, their name would become synonymous with terror across the entire civilized world. The first Gothic scouts who saw them approaching thought they were witnessing demons. These warriors wore clothing made from animal skins sewn together, their faces scarred from childhood rituals designed to teach them pain before they could even walk. They sat on small, hardy ponies that Roman observers described as ugly but impossibly tough, creatures that could travel for days without rest, surviving on nothing but sparse grass and their own endurance. The riders themselves seemed to live entirely on horseback, eating, sleeping, conducting business, and making war without ever dismounting. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a military officer who documented their arrival, wrote that the Huns were almost glued to their horses and that they were so accustomed to riding that they walked clumsily on the ground, their legs bowed from a lifetime in the saddle. What made the Huns different wasn't just their appearance or their lifestyle, it was their approach to warfare, a methodology so radically different from anything Europeans had experienced that it rendered centuries of military doctrine obsolete overnight. The Romans and Germanic peoples fought in formations, shield walls and ordered ranks where discipline and unit cohesion determined victory. The Huns fought like a storm, appearing from nowhere, striking with devastating force and vanishing before any organized response could materialize. They were masters of mobility, using speed as both weapon and defense, and their primary instrument of war was a technological marvel that gave them an almost supernatural advantage. The composite bow carried by Hunnic warriors was not merely a weapon, it was a masterpiece of engineering that represented hundreds of years of steppe refinement. Unlike the simple wooden bows used by Europeans, the Hunnic bow was constructed from multiple materials: wood, horn, and sinew, laminated together with powerful animal glues to create a weapon that stored and released energy with terrifying efficiency. The belly of the bow, the side facing the archer, was made from horn, typically from water buffalo, which compressed when the bow was drawn. The back of the bow, facing the target, was layered with sinew from animal tendons which stretched under tension. Between these layers was a wooden core that provided structure and flexibility. When unstrung, these bows curved backward in a dramatic C shape, storing potential energy even at rest. The stiffened ends of the bow, called siars in the languages of the steppe peoples, were lengthened and set at sharply recurved angles. This design allowed the bow to be relatively short, typically less than 4 feet in length, making it perfect for use on horseback, while still generating the power of a much longer bow. A skilled archer could send an arrow over 500 feet with accuracy, and the short pull required meant that arrows could be loosed rapidly, creating a rain of projectiles that overwhelmed enemy formations. But the bow was only part of the equation. The real secret to Hunnic military dominance was the synthesis of horse, bow, and rider into a single weapon system that had been refined over generations of steppe warfare. Hun children learned to ride before they could walk properly. By the age of 3 or 4, they were already competent horsemen, able to guide their mounts with their legs alone, leaving both hands free for the bow. By adolescence, they could shoot accurately at full gallop, turn in the saddle to fire backward in the famous Parthian shot, and reload while riding at speed. This wasn't just skill, it was a way of life so deeply ingrained that it became instinctive. The horses themselves were crucial to this system. Though Roman sources described them as ugly, these were descendants of the hardy Mongolian ponies of the Central Asian steppes, animals bred by millennia of natural selection to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. Standing only about 13 to 14 hands high, small enough to be technically classified as ponies, these creatures were extraordinarily tough. They could survive on sparse grass and required little water, drinking only once per day under normal conditions. In winter, they would eat snow for moisture and dig through it with their hooves to reach the grass beneath. They could lose up to 30% of their body weight during harsh winters and regain it in the summer, a resilience that no European horse could match. More importantly, these horses were fast, tireless, and could maintain their pace for incredible distances. Hun warriors typically travelled with multiple horses, changing mounts frequently to preserve their animals' strength. The horses were primarily mares, which provided an additional crucial resource. Hun warriors would milk their horses multiple times per day during campaigns, each milking producing about 50 grams of milk. This mare's milk could be fermented into kumis or airag, nutritious drinks that could sustain a warrior for days when other food was scarce. The ability to carry their food supply with them, constantly renewable, gave Hunnic armies a logistical advantage that settled civilizations couldn't comprehend. Roman and Gothic armies needed supply trains, baggage animals, and secure supply lines. The Huns simply brought their supplies with them, living off their herds as they moved. This mobility translated into tactical capabilities that seemed almost magical to their opponents. Hun armies could cover distances in a single day that would take Roman forces a week. They could appear outside a city with no warning, having travelled through terrain that conventional armies considered impassable. They could divide into multiple smaller forces, strike simultaneously at widely separated targets, and reunite before any response could be coordinated. The psychological impact was immense. Town after town received news of Hunnic raids only after the raids had already happened. Messengers couldn't travel faster than the Huns themselves, creating a pervasive sense of helplessness among the settled populations. When the Huns first crossed into Europe in the 370s, they demonstrated these capabilities with devastating effect. The Alans, a nomadic Iranian people who had themselves terrorized the steppes for generations, were crushed in a series of lightning campaigns. The Ostrogoths, a powerful Germanic confederation under King Ermanaric, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't pin down or defeat. Traditional Gothic warfare revolved around infantry formations supported by small numbers of cavalry. Against an enemy that refused to engage in set-piece battles that struck and vanished like smoke, these formations were useless. The Ostrogothic Confederation shattered, and tens of thousands fled westward into Roman territory, desperate to escape the Hunnic onslaught. The Visigoths soon followed, and by 376 massive numbers of desperate Germanic refugees were crossing the Danube into Roman territory. The empire, already weakened by internal strife and economic problems, found itself overwhelmed by people fleeing an enemy they described in almost supernatural terms. The Romans, accustomed to dealing with Germanic tribes through a combination of military force and diplomacy, suddenly faced a completely different kind of threat. The Huns didn't want to settle in the empire, they wanted to dominate it, to extract tribute and plunder without the burden of actually governing territory. The Hunnic tactical system was built around several key principles that seemed simple, but were devastatingly effective in execution. First was the feigned retreat, a tactic perfected by steppe peoples over countless generations. Hunnic warriors would approach an enemy formation, loose a volley of arrows, and then appear to flee in disarray. Disciplined troops might hold their position, but the natural instinct was to pursue. Germanic and Roman warriors, eager for glory and conditioned by centuries of combat where closing with the enemy was the path to victory, would break formation to chase down the apparently fleeing Huns. This was exactly what the Huns wanted. Once the enemy formation was broken and spread out, the Huns would wheel their horses and counterattack, their composite bows cutting down scattered soldiers who no longer had the protection of their shields and comrades. Or they would lead the pursuers into an ambush, where fresh Hun warriors waited to attack from multiple directions. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing from personal military experience, captured the essence of Hunnic tactics in a passage that would define Western understanding of steppe warfare for centuries. He wrote that when provoked, the Huns would enter battle drawn up in wedge-shaped masses, making a savage noise with their medley of voices. They were lightly equipped for swift motion and unexpected in action, dividing suddenly into scattered bands and attacking while rushing about in disorder here and there, dealing terrific slaughter. Because of their extraordinary rapidity of movement, they were never seen to attack a rampart or pillage an enemy's camp in traditional fashion. This apparent disorder was actually carefully orchestrated chaos. Hunnic warriors operated in flexible bands that could coordinate without rigid command structures. Each warrior was a skilled individual combatant who understood the overall tactical plan and could adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders. This decentralized command system, born from necessity and the vast openness of the steppe, where close command and control was impossible, gave Hunnic forces a responsiveness that hierarchical Roman and Germanic armies couldn't match. The use of lassos or twisted cloth ropes was another unconventional tactic that European forces found nearly impossible to counter. Hunnic warriors would ride close to enemy infantry, throw their lassos around soldiers' necks or limbs, and then spur their horses away, dragging the victim across the ground or pulling them from formation. This created panic in infantry ranks, as soldiers realized they could be individually targeted and pulled away from the safety of their comrades. The psychological impact was profound. Warriors who had trained their entire lives to fight in formation, whose courage depended on the presence of their fellow soldiers beside them, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to being singled out and killed in isolation. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Hunnic warfare was the sheer volume of arrows they could produce. A skilled Hunnic archer could maintain sustained fire for extended periods, loosing arrow after arrow with mechanical precision. Unlike European archers who might carry 20 or 30 arrows, Hun warriors carried larger quivers and, more importantly, could resupply from pack animals that accompanied their forces. The arrows themselves were relatively light but deadly at the ranges Hunnic bows could achieve. Tipped with iron, bone, or sometimes just sharpened hardwood, they weren't designed to penetrate heavy armour at long range. They didn't need to be. The Huns would bombard enemy formations from distances where return fire was impossible, targeting horses, exposed flesh, and gradually wearing down their opponent's will to fight. By the time the Huns closed for melee combat, if they bothered to close at all, the enemy was already demoralized, wounded, and exhausted. When forced into close combat, Hun warriors weren't helpless. They carried long, straight swords over a metre in length, designed for use from horseback. Archaeological evidence, including a spectacular find near the Pannonhalma Monastery in Hungary in 1979, revealed swords of impressive craftsmanship. These weapons were similar in size and design to the gauntlet swords used by Maratha warriors in India centuries later, suggesting a common understanding among cavalry peoples of what worked in mounted combat. The Huns also used javelins and close-range archery, and by the 5th century they had incorporated infantry units, recruited from conquered Germanic peoples, adding tactical flexibility to their traditional cavalry strength. The Hunnic way of war wasn't just about tactics and technology. It was inseparable from their entire lifestyle and culture. Unlike the Romans, who tried to separate military and civilian life, or the Germanic peoples, who valued farming alongside warfare, the Huns were a military society in the most complete sense. Every aspect of their existence was oriented toward making war. Children were ritually scarred on their faces before they could even nurse, a practice designed to teach them to endure pain. This artificial cranial deformation and facial scarring served multiple purposes. It created a distinctive, frightening appearance that enhanced the Huns' psychological warfare. It also served as a rite of passage, marking individuals as part of the Hunnic people and hardening them from infancy. The nomadic pastoral lifestyle that sustained the Huns between campaigns was itself a form of military training. Herding animals across vast distances developed the riding skills, endurance, and navigation abilities that made Hunnic armies so mobile. Hunting for game provided practice with the bow and taught warriors to work cooperatively to surround and kill prey, skills directly applicable to human combat. The very act of surviving on the steppe, dealing with extreme weather, scarce resources, and the constant threat from rival groups, created a population that was physically tough and psychologically adapted to hardship and violence. This cultural context helps explain why the Huns seem so inexplicable to Roman and Christian observers. The Romans saw war as a means to an end, fought to secure borders, punish enemies, or expand territory. The Huns seemed to fight for its own sake, to live for warfare in a way that civilized peoples found incomprehensible and terrifying. Religious leaders in the Christian Roman Empire interpreted the Huns as divine punishment, a scourge sent by God to chastise a sinful civilization. The prayer that spread through Europe captured this terror perfectly. From the arrows of the Huns, O Lord, defend us. By the early 5th century, the Huns had established themselves as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. Various tribes paid them tribute, supplied them with warriors, and acknowledged Hunnic supremacy. The Eastern Roman Empire found itself in the humiliating position of paying massive annual tributes, hundreds of pounds of gold, simply to keep the Huns from raiding Roman territory. This arrangement suited the Huns perfectly. Why govern cities and farms when you could simply extract wealth from those who did? Why deal with the complexities of administration when tribute and plunder could provide everything needed? The Hun Confederation during this period was a complex political entity that scholars still debate. Early Hun groups appear to have been relatively loosely organised, collections of clans and family groups that would unite under successful war leaders for specific campaigns and then disperse. But by the time of King Rugila in the 420s, something more sophisticated had emerged. Rugila negotiated formal treaties with the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II, establishing the Huns as a recognised political entity with claims and rights that had to be respected. When Rugila died in 433, power passed to his two nephews, Attila and Bleda, who ruled jointly for over a decade. The relationship between settled empires and nomadic peoples has always been complex, and the Huns exemplified this complexity. They needed the agricultural production and manufacturing of settled societies for many goods. Hunnic warriors wore clothing woven from textiles they couldn't produce themselves. They valued silk, jewellery, and worked metal objects that required sedentary civilizations to create. At the same time, these civilizations needed the Huns as allies against other threats, as mercenaries, and sometimes as trading partners. The Roman general Flavius Aetius, who would later face Attila at the Battle of Chalons, had spent years as a hostage among the Huns and used Hunnic warriors as the core of his military power in the Western Empire. The line between friend and enemy was often blurry, determined by immediate political circumstances rather than inherent antagonism. This changed when Attila murdered his brother Bleda around 445 and became sole ruler of the Hunnic Confederation. Attila was a different kind of leader than previous Hunnic chiefs. He had been educated, possibly including some exposure to classical literature and Roman political thought. He understood the psychology of both his own people and his enemies. He combined the traditional Hunnic emphasis on military prowess with a more sophisticated approach to diplomacy and political manipulation. Under Attila, the Huns reached their greatest extent, controlling territory from the Rhine River in the west to beyond the Volga in the east, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Danube in the south. Attila's campaigns in the 440s against the Eastern Roman Empire demonstrated the full potential of Hunnic military power. In 441, Hunnic forces launched a massive invasion of the Balkans, destroying cities and towns with methodical efficiency. The city of Naissus, modern Niš in Serbia, was utterly destroyed, its population killed or enslaved. Contemporary accounts describe the banks of the Danube covered with bones for years afterward. The Huns pushed to within 20 miles of Constantinople itself before Emperor Theodosius agreed to a new treaty with even more onerous terms. The annual tribute was increased to £2,100 of gold, a staggering sum that represented a significant portion of the empire's revenue. But gold and tribute weren't Attila's only goals. In 450, he received a message that would lead to his invasion of Western Europe. Honoria, sister of Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, sent Attila her ring and a plea for help. She was being forced into a marriage she didn't want and apparently thought the king of the Huns could rescue her. Attila interpreted this as a marriage proposal and demanded half of the Western Empire as her dowry. When Valentinian refused, Attila had his excuse for invasion. In early 451, Attila crossed the Rhine with an enormous army. Modern estimates suggest he commanded between 30,000 and 50,000 warriors. Though ancient sources claim much higher numbers, this force wasn't purely Hunnic. By this point, the Hun Confederation included Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Siri, Heruli, Thuringians, Alans, Burgundians, and even some Frankish groups. It was a multi-ethnic coalition held together by Attila's personal authority and the promise of plunder. The diversity of this force actually enhanced its capabilities, as Attila could field not just his incomparable Hun cavalry, but also Germanic infantry skilled in siege warfare and close combat. The invasion devastated Gaul. City after city fell to the Huns. Metz was sacked on April 7th, its defenders slaughtered and its churches burned. Reims, Strasbourg, Cologne, Trier all fell before the Hunnic advance. The speed of the invasion paralysed any coordinated response. By the time word of the Hun attack on one city reached potential defenders, the Huns had already moved on to the next target. It was a demonstration of operational-level mobility that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the mechanised warfare of the 20th century. The city of Orleans, Aurelianum in Latin, became the turning point. The city was strategically vital, guarding an important crossing of the Loire River and serving as the gateway to Aquitaine. Attila besieged it, but the defenders held out long enough for a relief force to arrive. Roman general Flavius Aetius had accomplished something remarkable. He had assembled a coalition army that included his Roman forces, Visigoths under King Theodoric, Franks, Burgundians, Alans and various other groups. This force marched to Orleans and broke the siege on June 14th, forcing Attila to withdraw. Aetius pursued, and on June 20th, 451, the two armies met somewhere on the Catalonian plains near present-day Châlons-en-Champagne. The exact location has never been definitively identified, which is fitting for a battle that seemed to exist half in reality and half in legend even to those who fought in it. Both armies numbered at least 50,000 warriors, possibly significantly more. It was one of the largest battles of the ancient world, and certainly one of the most ethnically diverse, with peoples from across Europe and Asia meeting in combat. The battle itself defies easy description, because our sources are limited and often contradictory. What we know suggests a struggle of epic proportions. The Visigoths seized a crucial height, giving Aetius a tactical advantage. Theodoric led his cavalry in a massive charge against the Hunnic centre, where Attila had positioned his Hun warriors while placing his allied Germanic peoples on the flanks. The combat was desperate and brutal. Ancient sources speak of hand-to-hand fighting that lasted into the night, of the ground becoming slippery with blood, of the sounds of battle being unlike anything warriors had experienced before. King Theodoric fell during the battle, killed either by a Hun arrow or crushed in the press of combat. His death, rather than breaking Visigoth morale, seemed to inspire them to greater fury. The Visigoths pushed forward, and gradually the Hun forces found themselves being compressed and driven back. By nightfall, Attila had withdrawn his warriors into a fortified camp, preparing for a final stand. He reportedly built a funeral pyre from horse saddles, planning to burn himself alive rather than be captured if the Romans and Goths stormed his position the next morning. They never did. Aetius, for reasons that historians still debate, chose not to attack. Some sources suggest he feared that a complete Visigoth victory would make them too powerful, that he needed the Huns as a counterweight to other threats. Others propose that Attila's position was too strong to assault, that casualties would have been catastrophic. Whatever the reason, Attila was allowed to retreat, leading his battered but intact army back across the Rhine. The immediate threat to Gaul was ended. But Attila wasn't finished. In 452, he invaded Italy, seeking the wealth of the Western Empire's heartland and still claiming Honoria as his bride. His army rampaged through northern Italy, destroying Aquileia so completely that its survivors founded Venice on islands in the lagoon where they thought they would be safe from the Huns. Attila pushed as far as the Po River, and panic gripped Rome itself. Pope Leo I led a delegation to meet Attila and negotiated some kind of agreement. Exactly what transpired is unknown, but Attila withdrew from Italy without marching on Rome itself. Disease and famine in his army, the threat of Eastern Roman forces attacking his homeland, and perhaps the promise of future tribute from Rome all likely played roles in his decision. But he never had the chance to return. In 453, on his wedding night to a young woman named Ildico, Attila suffered a nosebleed, possibly due to drinking heavily during the celebration. He passed out face down and drowned in his own blood, one of history's most anticlimactic deaths for one of its most formidable conquerors. Attila's death shattered the Hunnic Confederation almost immediately. His sons fought each other for supremacy, turning the Hun military machine inward in civil war. The subject peoples, held in the Confederation only by Attila's personal authority and fear of Hunnic military power, rebelled. In 454, at the Battle of Nidau in Pannonia, a coalition of Germanic peoples defeated the Huns decisively. Within a decade, the Huns had fragmented and dispersed, absorbed into other peoples or retreating back to the steppes from which they had come. The collapse was so complete that it seems almost inexplicable. How could a people who had dominated Europe for decades simply vanish? The answer lies in understanding what the Huns really were. They weren't a unified ethnic group in the modern sense, but rather a confederation of peoples bound together by military success and the redistribution of plunder. When that military success ended, when the flow of wealth from tribute and raids dried up, the bonds holding the confederation together dissolved. The Hunnic military system required constant warfare to sustain itself. Warriors needed horses, weapons, and supplies that could only be acquired through raiding or tribute. Leaders maintained their authority by distributing wealth to their followers. When Attila died and the system of organized raiding collapsed, individual groups had to find other ways to survive. Some joined other confederations, some settled down to farming, some continued raiding on a smaller scale. But the Huns as a unified political and military force ceased to exist. Yet their legacy was profound and permanent. The Hunnic invasions had triggered the great migrations that reshaped Europe. Gothic peoples fleeing the Huns established kingdoms in Spain and Italy. Vandals crossed into North Africa. Burgundians, Franks, and other Germanic peoples moved into Gaul and gradually established the foundations of medieval European kingdoms. The Roman Empire, particularly in the West, never recovered from the combined stresses of these movements. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476, just 23 years after Attila's death, when the last emperor was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. Historians debate how much the Huns contributed to this collapse versus other factors, but there's no question they accelerated processes that were already underway. More subtly, the Huns changed European military thinking in ways that persisted for centuries. They demonstrated the power of cavalry when properly used, lessons that led to the development of cataphracts in the late Roman army and eventually to medieval knights. The importance of mobility, of avoiding predictable patterns, of psychological warfare, these concepts all gained prominence partly because of the Hunnic example. The Byzantines, heirs to the Eastern Roman Empire, developed cavalry tactics heavily influenced by steppe peoples, creating some of the most effective military forces of the medieval period. The composite bow itself, though the Huns didn't invent it, became more widely appreciated in Europe after Hunnic invasions. Roman armies had always used auxiliary archers, but they became more numerous and better equipped after the 5th century. Hungarian forces in the medieval period, possibly influenced by folk memory of the Huns, made extensive use of mounted archers and maintained that tradition longer than almost any other European people. The famous Polish hussars of the early modern period, celebrated as some of history's greatest cavalry, drew on traditions that traced back through centuries to the steppe peoples who had taught Europe what cavalry could really do. Even the psychological impact persisted. For centuries after the Huns vanished, their name was invoked to describe barbaric enemies. When the Mongols invaded Europe in the 13th century, terrified Christians called them the New Huns, recognizing similar tactics and similar terror. During World War I, British propaganda referred to Germans as Huns, trying to evoke associations with mindless barbarism and devastation. The name had become disconnected from the actual historical people and transformed into a symbol of otherness and destruction. Modern scholarship has tried to move beyond these stereotypes to understand who the Huns really were. This hasn't been easy. The Huns left no written records, no inscriptions, no literature. Everything we know about them comes from their enemies and victims, sources that had every reason to exaggerate and demonize. Archaeological evidence is limited because the Hunnic lifestyle left few traces. Nomadic peoples don't build stone structures or create large cemeteries with grave goods. Even Hunnic burials are difficult to identify with certainty, as they borrowed cultural practices from the many peoples they interacted with. What emerges from careful analysis is a picture more complex than simple savagery. The Huns were sophisticated in their way, masters of a military art that required intelligence, planning, and coordination. They weren't mindless destroyers, but rather pragmatic actors pursuing their interests through means that happened to be violent. They could be diplomatic when diplomacy served their purposes, brutal when brutality was more effective. They absorbed cultural influences from the peoples they conquered while maintaining a distinct identity tied to their steppe origins and nomadic lifestyle. The question of Hunnic origins remains one of history's enduring mysteries. The traditional theory, which links them to the Yongnu people who fought with the Chinese Han Dynasty, has been both supported and challenged by modern genetic and archaeological evidence. Some scholars argue for direct continuity, suggesting that Xiongnu groups moved westward over centuries, eventually emerging in Europe as the Huns. Others point to significant differences in burial practices, material culture, and genetic makeup, arguing that the Huns were a separate people, or that the name Hun was applied by Europeans to various steppe peoples without necessarily indicating a single ethnic identity. Recent genetic studies of individuals buried in Hunnic sites show extraordinary diversity, with some showing East Asian ancestry, others showing European connections, and many showing mixed heritage. This supports the view that the Huns were less a single people than a confederation that absorbed many different groups. The Hunnic language, of which only a few words survived in historical records, remains too poorly attested to definitively link with any modern language family, though Turkic connections have been proposed. What matters more than origins, perhaps, is understanding what the Huns represented in their time and what they teach us about warfare and history. They demonstrated that technological superiority, in this case the composite bow and steppe horses, combined with cultural adaptations and tactical innovation, could overcome supposedly more advanced civilizations. The Romans had better metallurgy, engineering, and logistics, but they couldn't effectively counter an enemy who refused to fight on Roman terms. The Huns showed that mobility and flexibility could defeat numerical superiority in fortified positions. These are lessons that military thinkers have had to relearn repeatedly throughout history. The Huns also illustrate the limits of military power without institutional structures. Their confederation, based entirely on military success and personal loyalty to leaders, couldn't survive setbacks or the death of a charismatic ruler. Empires built on plunder and tribute are inherently unstable because they require constant expansion to sustain themselves. When expansion stops, the system collapses. The Romans, for all their flaws, had created institutional structures that could survive individual emperors. The Huns never made that transition, and when Attila died, everything he had built died with him. There's a certain irony in how the story ended. The Huns, who had seemed invincible, who had bent the Roman Empire to their will and reshaped Europe through military might, vanished almost overnight. The Romans, who had been humiliated and forced to pay tribute, survived in various forms for another 1,000 years. Not the Western Empire, which did fall, but the Eastern Roman Empire, which became Byzantium and lasted until 1453, and the cultural and religious legacy of Rome, which shaped European civilization into the modern era. Military power alone, the Huns proved, cannot build lasting structures. It can destroy, reshape, terrify, and temporarily dominate, but without the capacity to create institutions, to build rather than just conquer, even the most fearsome military machine eventually crumbles. Yet, perhaps it's wrong to speak of the Huns vanishing. Genetically, they almost certainly didn't disappear, but were absorbed into the populations of Eastern Europe, their descendants becoming part of the Hungarian, Romanian, and various Slavic peoples. Culturally, their influence persisted in military traditions, horsemanship, and folk memories that may have influenced later societies. The techniques they mastered, the composite bow, mounted archery, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare, became part of the military toolkit that later steppe peoples like the Avars, Magyars, and eventually the Mongols would use to similar effect. When Genghis Khan's Mongol armies swept across Asia and Europe in the 13th century, using tactics almost identical to those the Huns had employed 800 years earlier, they were drawing on a continuous tradition of steppe warfare that stretched back millennia. The Mongols succeeded where the Huns had ultimately failed, building an empire with administrative structures that outlasted any single Khan. But the military foundations, the integration of horse, bow, and rider, into a mobile weapon system of devastating effectiveness, this was something the Mongols inherited rather than invented. The Huns were part of a longer story, one chapter in the history of how steppe peoples repeatedly conquered settled civilizations through superior mobility and archery. This broader context helps explain both Hunnic's success and their limitations. The steppe nomadic lifestyle produced warriors of exceptional quality, but the population that could be sustained by pastoral nomadism was relatively small compared to agricultural civilizations. The Huns probably never numbered more than a few 100,000 people total, with perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 warriors at their peak. They dominated a much larger population through superior military capabilities, but this meant that losses were difficult to replace. When the Huns suffered defeat, or even just heavy casualties, they couldn't simply recruit more warriors. This vulnerability to attrition was a fundamental limitation that all steppe empires faced. The climate also played a role that historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Recent paleoclimate studies suggest that the 430s through the 450s, the peak period of Attila's raids, were marked by severe drought in Central Europe. This would have disrupted agriculture and made pastoral nomadism even more challenging than usual. The Hun raids into Roman territory may have been driven partly by environmental necessity, a people struggling to survive in a deteriorating climate, extracting resources from areas less affected by drought. This doesn't excuse the violence, but it adds context that pure narratives of barbarism miss. The Huns, like all peoples, were responding to their circumstances with the tools and culture available to them. Looking at the Hunnic period from our modern perspective, it's tempting to see it as a clash of civilizations, barbarism versus civilization, nomads versus settlers. But this interpretation, inherited from Roman sources written by people who feared and hated the Huns, misses the complexity of what actually happened. The Huns weren't trying to destroy civilization, they were trying to profit from it. Attila negotiated treaties, employed Roman advisors, and showed himself capable of sophisticated diplomacy. The violence wasn't mindless, but directed towards specific political and economic goals. If the Huns seemed especially brutal to Roman observers, we might remember that Rome itself had built an empire through conquest and maintained it through violence on a scale that dwarfed anything the Huns ever achieved. The real significance of the Huns isn't that they were especially barbaric or savage. It's that they represented a different model of human organization, one based on mobility and military prowess rather than urban settlement and agriculture. For a few decades in the 5th century, this nomadic model proved superior in military terms to the settled empires that had dominated Eurasia for centuries. This was a profound shock to people who assumed that civilization, meaning cities, writing, and complex institutions, was inherently superior to simpler forms of social organization. The Huns showed that under certain conditions nomadic peoples could defeat settled empires, could extract tribute from civilizations that prided themselves on their military might, could reshape the political landscape according to their own needs and desires. This shock reverberates through the historical sources we have. Roman writers struggling to explain how the Huns could be so effective reached for supernatural explanations or emphasized their supposed subhuman nature, because the alternative, that Roman military superiority was an illusion, that civilization didn't guarantee victory, was too disturbing to accept. The need to explain the Huns as demonic or barbaric wasn't just prejudice, though it was certainly that. It was also a defensive psychological mechanism, a way to preserve the belief that civilization was progressive and superior even in the face of evidence that militarily, at least temporarily, it wasn't. In the end, what controlled the battlefield during the Hunnic period wasn't civilization or barbarism, wasn't Rome or the steppes. What controlled the battlefield was the deadly combination of the composite bow, the hardy steppe horse, and the cultural system that produced warriors who were masters of both from childhood. This integration of technology, biology, and culture created a military capability that the armies of settled civilizations couldn't effectively counter with their existing doctrines and structures. The Huns didn't win because they were more savage, or because they had some kind of moral superiority. They won because they had a military system better adapted to the conditions of 5th century warfare in Europe, a system built on mobility, firepower, and psychological dominance. That system had its limits, and those limits eventually led to Hunnic collapse. But for a brief moment in history, steppe warriors truly did control the battlefield, and the settled civilizations of Europe had no choice but to acknowledge that control, pay tribute, and hope they could survive until the storm passed. The Huns taught Europe a hard lesson about the nature of military power, about how technological and cultural advantages could overcome supposedly superior civilizations, about how quickly the balance of power could shift when new capabilities emerged. It was a lesson Europe wouldn't forget, even after the Huns themselves had vanished into the mists of history and legend, their name preserved more as a symbol than a memory of the complex, sophisticated, and terrifyingly effective warriors they had actually been. The impact of Hunnic warfare extended far beyond the immediate military victories and defeats. The very structure of European society began to transform in response to the threat they represented. Roman landowners in frontier regions, unable to rely on imperial protection, began fortifying their estates and recruiting private armies. This was the beginning of a process that would eventually lead to feudalism, as local strongmen offered protection in exchange for loyalty and service. The centralized Roman state, which had maintained a monopoly on legitimate violence for centuries, found its authority fragmenting as desperate populations turned to anyone who could keep them safe from raiders, who moved faster than imperial armies could respond. The military reforms attempted by the late Roman Empire in response to Hunnic tactics were significant but ultimately insufficient. The Romans tried to recruit their own horse archers, drawing from Alan, Sarmatian and other steppe peoples who had been pushed into Roman territory by the Huns. They experimented with more mobile field armies, reducing reliance on static frontier defences that the Huns simply bypassed. They even attempted to copy Hunnic bows, though Roman craftsmen struggled to match the quality of weapons that represented generations of specialised knowledge. A composite bow wasn't just a piece of equipment you could manufacture like a sword or shield. It required specific materials, glues made from fish bladders or animal sinews, precise layering techniques, and months or even years of careful construction and seasoning. The Huns made these bows from childhood, understanding their creation as intimately as their use. Roman attempts to mass-produce similar weapons generally resulted in inferior copies. The economic impact of the Hunnic period was equally profound. The tribute payments demanded by Attila represented a massive drain on imperial resources. The Eastern Roman Empire was paying over £2,000 of gold annually at one point, equivalent to roughly 15% of the empire's total revenue. This gold flowed out of the Roman economy and into Hunnic hands, where it was used to purchase goods, reward followers, and maintain the political structure of the confederation. Some of this gold made its way even further east through trade networks, ending up in Persia, Central Asia, and possibly even China. Archaeological finds of Roman gold coins in locations as far away as Sri Lanka suggest the vast distances these economic ripples could travel. The loss of agricultural production from devastated regions compounded the economic crisis. When Hunnic armies swept through Gaul or the Balkans, they didn't just kill and plunder, they destroyed the infrastructure of agricultural life, burning farms, killing or stealing livestock, and massacring or enslaving the labour force. A region could take decades to recover from a single major raid. The cumulative effect of repeated Hunnic incursions was to reduce the tax base and economic productivity of the empire precisely when it needed resources most. This created a vicious cycle where reduced revenues meant less money for defence, which meant more successful raids, which further reduced revenues. The slave trade was another aspect of Hunnic warfare that had lasting consequences. Thousands of people were captured during Hun raids and sold into slavery, or kept as servants and labourers by the Huns themselves. Roman prisoners were sometimes ransomed back to the empire for exorbitant prices, providing another revenue stream for the Huns. Those who couldn't be ransomed faced lives of servitude, either working for Hunnic masters or being sold to slave traders who distributed them throughout the Mediterranean world. The memoirs of Priscus of Panium, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court in 449, include a fascinating encounter with a Greek merchant who had been captured, enslaved, won his freedom through bravery in battle for the Huns, and chosen to remain among them rather than return to the empire. This man claimed he was better off as a free man among the Huns than as a taxpayer in the Roman Empire, a devastating indictment of Roman society from someone who had experienced both. The religious dimensions of the Hun invasions shaped medieval Christianity in ways that persisted for centuries. Christian theologians struggled to explain why God would permit such devastation. Some saw the Huns as divine punishment for Roman sins, a view that reinforced calls for religious reform and moral purification. Others portrayed the struggle against the Huns as a holy war, an early version of the crusading ideology that would dominate medieval European thought. The intercession of saints became a major theme in Christian accounts of the period. Pope Leo III's confrontation with Attila was credited to divine intervention, with legends growing that Saints Peter and Paul appeared to Attila in visions, threatening him with death if he attacked Rome. Whether Attila saw any such visions is unknowable, but the legend served Christian purposes by demonstrating the power of faith against temporal might. The cult of martyrs and saints who died during Hunnic raids proliferated in the aftermath. Saint Ursula and her legendary 11,000 virgin companions, supposedly massacred by the Huns at Cologne, became one of medieval Christianity's most popular devotional focuses, despite the story being almost certainly fictional or vastly exaggerated. The conflation of Huns with various barbarian groups in medieval legends made them stock villains in Christian narratives, symbols of pagan violence overcome by Christian virtue. This religious framing obscured the more complex reality of Hunnic-Roman relations, where pragmatic accommodation was as common as violent conflict. The Hunnic period also accelerated the militarization of the Christian Church itself. Bishops increasingly took on defensive responsibilities in their cities, organizing militias, negotiating with raiders, and sometimes leading combat operations. The image of the warrior bishop, exemplified by figures like Germanus of Auxerre, who supposedly led British forces against Saxon raiders while serving as a bishop, emerged partly in response to the collapse of secular authority during the crisis. This would have profound implications for medieval European society, where the church became a major landowner and military power in its own right. Germanic peoples caught between the Huns and Romans faced impossible choices that shaped the formation of the medieval European kingdoms. Groups like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals and Burgundians were simultaneously fleeing Hunnic domination, fighting as Hunnic allies, and trying to carve out their own territories within or beside the Roman Empire. The experience of fighting alongside the Huns, observing their tactics and organisation, influenced Germanic military development. The increasing emphasis on cavalry among Germanic peoples in the 5th and 6th centuries, moving away from their earlier heavy reliance on infantry, owed something to the Hunnic example. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric, who had spent years as hostages and allies of the Huns, established a kingdom in Italy that blended Germanic, Roman and steppe influences in its military organisation. The psychological trauma of the Hunnic invasions echoed through generations. Grandparents who had survived Hun raids passed down stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The image of mounted archers appearing from nowhere, moving with supernatural speed, killing from distances where defence was impossible, became embedded in European folk memory. When later steppe peoples, the Avars in the 6th century, the Magyars in the 9th and 10th centuries, invaded Europe using similar tactics, the terror was immediate and visceral because cultural memory of the Huns provided a template for understanding the threat. The Magyar invasions of Europe in the 10th century were explicitly compared to the Hunnic invasions by contemporary chroniclers, and the terror they inspired was magnified by the collective memory of what steppe warriors had done before. The Hungarian people, who settled in the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, faced a complex relationship with Hunnic legacy. Medieval Hungarian chronicles, particularly the Gesta Hungarorum, claim direct descent from the Huns, portraying Attila as a Hungarian hero and the Magyar settlement as a return rather than a new invasion. Modern scholarship is sceptical of direct ethnic continuity. The Magyars were Finno-Ugric peoples from the Ural region, while the Hunnic ethnicity remains disputed, but the political usefulness of the connection was clear. Claiming Hunnic heritage legitimized Hungarian rule over territories the Huns had once dominated, and provided a martial pedigree that reinforced the Magyar warrior aristocracy's prestige. This invented or claimed continuity meant that Hunnic legacy lived on in European consciousness through Hungarian identity, creating a strange situation where the descendants, or supposed descendants of the fearsome raiders, became Christian defenders of Europe against later invaders. The archaeological record of the Hunnic period, while sparse, reveals fascinating details about the material culture that supported their military dominance. Hunnic burials, when definitively identified, show a mixture of steppe traditions and influences absorbed from conquered peoples. The practice of artificial cranial deformation, achieved by binding infants' heads with tight cloths, created the distinctive elongated skulls that mark some burials as Hunnic or Hunnic influenced. The purpose of this practice, whether aesthetic, ritualistic, or social marking, remains debated, but its presence across a wide geographic area suggests the spread of Hunnic cultural influence even among peoples who weren't ethnically Hunnic. Horse burials and grave goods provide insights into Hunnic material culture. The horses interred with warriors were typically small by modern standards, around 13 hands high, but examinations of their skeletal remains reveal robust bone structure and evidence of hard use. These weren't pampered animals, but working partners subjected to the enormous physical demands of constant riding and warfare. The bits and bridles found in these graves show sophisticated metalworking, with decorative elements that drew on artistic traditions from across Eurasia. Hunnic art, what little survives, displays a distinctive style that blended animal motifs from steppe traditions, with geometric patterns and occasionally borrowed elements from Germanic or Roman sources. Weapons recovered from Hunnic period sites reveal the multi-ethnic nature of the Confederation. Alongside remains of composite bows, which rarely survive due to their organic construction, archaeologists find long swords of Germanic style, Roman spatha, and occasionally Eastern influences like Sassanid Persian blade forms. This eclectic armory reflected the Hunnic practice of incorporating warriors from conquered peoples and adopting whatever weapons proved effective. The Huns weren't dogmatic about equipment, they were pragmatic. If a captured Roman sword worked better than a traditional weapon for certain tasks, they used it. This adaptability extended to tactics as well. Later Hunnic armies under Attila employed siege engines, operated by Germanic or Roman engineers, showing their willingness to adopt technologies from settled civilizations when those technologies proved useful. The logistics of Hunnic campaigns, often overlooked in dramatic accounts of battles and raids, were actually remarkable achievements. Moving tens of thousands of warriors, along with their multiple horses and support personnel, across hundreds of miles of varied terrain required sophisticated coordination. The Huns used advanced scouts extensively, not just to locate enemies but to identify water sources, grazing areas, and potential obstacles. Their intimate knowledge of horses allowed them to judge exactly how far their mounts could travel in a day and when rest was necessary. The practice of keeping multiple horses per warrior wasn't just about having remounts in battle. It allowed the Huns to rotate their animals, preventing exhaustion and maintaining mobility over extended campaigns. Food procurement during campaigns combined hunting, foraging, and raiding. Hunnic warriors carried dried meat and fermented mare's milk products that could sustain them for days when other food was unavailable. They were accustomed to eating horses when necessary, a practice that horrified Romans who saw horses as too valuable and prestigious to slaughter for food. This meant that Hunnic armies carried their emergency rations with them in the form of their excess mounts. Combined with their ability to hunt while on the move, shooting game from horseback, and their willingness to loot food supplies from raided territories, the Huns achieved a level of logistical independence that conventional armies couldn't match. Roman armies needed supply trains, secure depots, and established supply lines. Hunnic armies could operate in enemy territory for months, living off the land and their herds. The communication systems that coordinated these dispersed forces remained somewhat mysterious, but were clearly effective. Unlike Roman armies with their formal command hierarchies and written orders, the Huns relied on mounted messengers, signal systems that may have included smoke or fire, and the shared understanding that came from a common culture and training. When Hunnic forces divided to attack multiple targets, as they frequently did, the commanders knew when and where to reunite without apparent need for complex coordination. This suggests either very detailed pre-battle planning or an impressive level of initiative and judgment among subordinate leaders. Probably it was both, a combination of general strategic direction from leaders, like Attila, with tactical flexibility for individual commanders who understood the overall objectives and could adapt to local circumstances. The terror tactics employed by the Huns were calculated and effective. They understood that reputation could do as much work as actual violence. By ensuring that accounts of their brutality spread widely, they created panic that weakened resistance before battles even began. Cities sometimes surrendered without a fight when they heard Hun armies were approaching, convinced that resistance was futile and hoping that cooperation might spare them the worst atrocities. This psychological warfare was cost-effective. Victories won through fear rather than actual combat preserved Hunnic strength for fights that couldn't be avoided. The mass killings and destruction that did occur served partially as military necessities, eliminating potential resistance and destroying enemy resources, but also as demonstrations meant to cow others into submission. The treatment of prisoners varied depending on Hunnic objectives. Valuable prisoners, nobles, wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen could be ransomed or enslaved for profit. Ordinary prisoners might be killed to spread terror, enslaved for labour, or sometimes released to spread word of Hunnic power. Priscus recorded that Roman prisoners held by the Huns lived in various conditions, some in brutal slavery, others achieving relatively comfortable positions by rendering valuable services. The confusion of Roman captives about their status, some being treated well while others suffered horribly, was itself a form of psychological manipulation. It created hope that cooperation might lead to better treatment, while demonstrating through examples of brutality what happened to those who proved useless or defiant. The diplomatic sophistication Attila demonstrated in his dealings with Rome challenges simplistic portrayals of the Huns as mindless barbarians. He exploited Roman internal divisions masterfully, playing Eastern and Western empires against each other, negotiating with rival factions within each empire, and using Roman exiles and defectors to understand imperial politics. Attila's court hosted Roman advisors, including some who had fled the empire or been exiled for political reasons. These men provided intelligence and advice that helped Attila navigate the complex diplomatic landscape. The famous episode where Attila claimed Honoria as his bride and demanded half the Western Empire wasn't simple barbarian lust for a Roman princess. It was a calculated diplomatic maneuver that provided justification for invasion while embarrassing the Western Emperor and exploiting Roman succession customs for Hunnic benefit. The embassies between Rome and the Hunnic court, documented in Priscus's first-hand account, reveal the complexities of this relationship. Roman ambassadors travelled deep into Hunnic territory, enduring conditions they found primitive and often humiliating. They were kept waiting, given places of lesser honour at feasts, subjected to Hunnic customs they found barbaric. Yet this was itself a form of negotiation, the Huns asserting their equality or superiority to Rome through ceremonial slights and demonstrations of power. Priscus described Attila's residence as surprisingly modest, a large wooden structure rather than a palace, suggesting either genuinely simple tastes or calculated presentation meant to emphasize Hunnic martial virtues over effete Roman luxury. Attila's personal behavior at feasts, eating from wooden plates while his guests used gold, reinforced this image of a warrior king unburdened by decadent refinements. The economic system that sustained the Hunnic Confederation during its peak years was based heavily on tribute and plunder, but also included trade and production. The Huns controlled valuable trade routes between East and West, and they could extract taxes or tariffs from merchants travelling through their territory. Archaeological evidence suggests some Hunnic groups engaged in limited metalworking and craft production, though they remained heavily dependent on imports for many manufactured goods. The tribute from Rome, paid in gold, was supplemented by tribute from Germanic peoples paid in goods, animals, and military service. This multi-source economy meant the Huns weren't entirely dependent on Roman payments, though those payments were certainly the largest single revenue source during Attila's reign. The distribution of wealth within Hunnic society followed patterns common to warrior cultures. Success in battle brought rewards in plunder and prestige. Leaders who distributed wealth generously to their followers earned loyalty and attracted more warriors to their service. Successful warriors could accumulate herds, slaves, and luxury goods that marked their status. Failed leaders or those who couldn't provide for their followers lost support. This system created intense pressure for constant military success. A leader who stopped raiding successfully or who failed in battle might find his warriors defecting to more successful rivals. This partly explains why the Hunnic Confederation collapsed so quickly after Attila's death. His sons couldn't match their father's success, and without the continuous flow of plunder and tribute that Attila had maintained, their followers had no reason to remain loyal. The linguistic legacy of the Huns is frustratingly limited. Only a handful of words recorded by ancient authors can be definitively attributed to Hunnic language. Names of leaders like Attila, Bleda, and Rugila have been analysed for linguistic clues, with various scholars proposing Turkic, Mongolic, or other Central Asian connections. The name Attila may derive from Turkic or Gothic roots meaning little father, though this is disputed. The scarcity of linguistic evidence reflects both the Huns' lack of literacy and the disinterest of literate Romans and Greeks in seriously studying the language of people they considered barbarians. This absence means we've lost irreplaceable information about Hunnic culture, worldview, and identity. Language shapes thought, and without access to how the Huns spoke, we can only guess at how they conceived of themselves and their place in the world. The religious beliefs of the Huns remain equally obscure. They were clearly not Christian, and Roman sources sometimes described them as godless, or as worshipping swords and other martial symbols. Evidence suggests shamanic practices similar to those of other Central Asian peoples, with shamans serving as intermediaries between human and spirit worlds, conducting rituals for healing, divination, and blessing military enterprises. Horse sacrifice appears to have played a role in Hun religious practice, with horses being particularly sacred animals that mediated between earthly and spiritual realms. The practice of divination, trying to foresee the outcomes of battles or the location of enemies through various ritual means, was mentioned by several ancient sources. Whether these practices were central to Hun religion, or peripheral superstitions is impossible to determine from the fragmented evidence. What's clear is that Hun religious practices or lack of orthodox religion mark them as outsiders to both Christian Romans and Germanic peoples who were converting to Christianity during this period. This religious difference reinforced cultural boundaries and made it easier for Christian authors to portray the Huns as demonic or subhuman. The religious dimension of the conflict wasn't initially central. The Huns weren't particularly interested in converting or suppressing Christianity. They were pragmatic about religion as about most things. But Christian writers made it central in their accounts, framing the struggle as godly civilization against godless barbarism, faith against paganism. This religious interpretation of the Hunnic Wars influenced medieval European identity, contributing to the sense that Christendom was a unified civilization defined partly in opposition to external pagan threats. The medical knowledge and practices of the Huns, like so much else about them, are largely unknown. They must have developed some battlefield medicine given their warrior culture and frequent combat. The treatment of wounds, the setting of broken bones, the care of injured horses, all would have required practical knowledge passed down through generations. The ritual scarring of infants, while having cultural purposes, might also have had medical justifications in Hun thinking, perhaps believed to strengthen the child or protect against diseases. The consumption of fermented mare's milk provided nutritional benefits beyond simple calories. The fermentation process created vitamins, and the probiotics aided digestion. Whether the Huns understood these benefits scientifically is doubtful, but they had learned through trial and error what worked. The roles of women in Hunnic society are even more obscure than most aspects of their culture. Ancient sources, written by men in patriarchal societies, rarely mentioned women unless they were politically significant like Honoria, or unless describing supposed barbaric customs. Some evidence suggests Hun women may have had more independence and authority than their Roman counterparts. Nomadic pastoral societies often grant women significant roles because their labour is essential for herding, processing animal products, and managing camp life while men are absent on hunts or raids. But whether Hun women participated in warfare, held political authority, or were relegated to purely domestic roles remains unknown. The absence of information itself tells us something about the biases of our sources, which couldn't imagine women as worth discussing in accounts of military and political affairs. The children of the Huns, those not yet warriors but being prepared for that role, lived lives oriented entirely toward their future function. Boys learned riding as toddlers, archery as children, and tactics and strategy as adolescents. Play was practice for war. Games involved skills directly applicable to combat. The physical development fostered by this lifestyle, constant riding, archery practice, exposure to the elements, created bodies adapted to the demands of steppe warfare. The psychological development, learning courage through exposure to violence, learning endurance through hardship, accepting hierarchy and discipline as natural, created minds suited to the warrior culture. This comprehensive education system, though informal and unwritten, was arguably more effective for producing warriors than the formal military training of settled civilizations. A Hun warrior by age 20 had 15 years of relevant experience. A Roman recruit might receive 6 months of basic training before being thrown into combat. The elderly Huns, those too old for active warfare, likely served as advisors, storytellers, and preservers of tradition. In a preliterate society, the elderly were repositories of knowledge about past battles, successful tactics, the behaviour of enemies, the location of water and pasture. Their experience was invaluable for planning campaigns and avoiding past mistakes. The respect for elders common in many traditional societies was probably present among the Huns as well, though again, direct evidence is lacking. The transmission of knowledge from generation to generation, of bow-making techniques, horse-breeding lore, tactical wisdom, all depended on old warriors teaching young ones. When we consider the totality of the Hunnic achievement, several factors stand out as crucial to their success. First was the integration of multiple technologies and practices into a coherent system. The composite bow, the hardy steppe horse, the cavalry tactics, the nomadic lifestyle, none of these individually was unique to the Huns. Other steppe peoples had similar capabilities. What made the Huns particularly effective in 5th century Europe was bringing this complete package to bear against enemies who had never faced it in its full intensity before. The Romans had encountered horse archers, had even employed them as auxiliaries. but they had never faced an entire army of expert horse archers moving with coordinated tactical sophistication on this scale. Second was timing. The Huns arrived in Europe at a moment when the Roman Empire was weakened by internal problems, economic stress, and military challenges on multiple fronts. A century earlier, when Roman military power was at its height, the impact might have been less severe. A century later, when Germanic kingdoms had consolidated and developed counter-tactics based on painful experience, the Huns might have found less success. But in the late 4th and 5th centuries, the timing was perfect for maximum disruption. Third was leadership. While the Huns had been formidable before Attila, his personal abilities as a military commander, diplomat, and political organizer took the confederation to its peak. He understood both steppe and Roman cultures, could operate effectively in both worlds, and had the vision to unite disparate groups into a powerful force. The fact that the confederation collapsed immediately after his death underscores how much depended on his individual capabilities. This is both a strength and weakness of personalistic power structures. Charismatic leaders can achieve remarkable things, but their achievements often die with them. Fourth was adaptability. The Huns were willing to learn from their enemies, adopt useful technologies and tactics, incorporate foreign warriors into their armies, and adjust their approach based on what worked. They weren't rigidly bound to traditional methods when innovation offered advantages. This flexibility, combined with a strong core identity and set of capabilities, gave them resilience and effectiveness against varied opponents. The end of the Hunnic threat brought enormous relief to Europe, but also new instabilities. The power vacuum left by Hunnic collapse was filled by Germanic kingdoms, whose conflicts shaped the early medieval period. The Eastern Roman Empire, freed from the burden of massive tribute payments, experienced a brief renaissance under Emperor Leo I and later Justinian. But the fundamental problems that had made the empire vulnerable to Hunnic predation, economic weakness, military manpower shortages, political instability, remained unresolved. Within 2 centuries, new threats from the east, the Avars, and eventually the Arabs, would again challenge Roman survival. The Gothic peoples, liberated from Hunnic dominance, established significant kingdoms. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric created a hybrid Roman-Germanic state in Italy that preserved much of Roman administration while adding Germanic military prowess. The Visigoths in Spain developed a sophisticated legal system that blended Roman and Germanic traditions. The Franks in Gaul laid the foundations for what would become France and the Carolingian Empire. These kingdoms were all shaped by their experiences with and against the Huns, by memories of what could happen when a powerful external force unified and swept across Europe. The longer historical arc suggests that the Hunnic invasions were one episode in a much longer series of interactions between steppe nomads and settled civilizations. This pattern of nomadic peoples from Central Asia, periodically erupting into the settled lands of Europe, the Middle East and China, played out repeatedly across millennia. The Scythians, Sarmatians, Xiongnu, Huns, Avars, Magyars, Pechenegs, Cumans, and Mongols all followed similar patterns. They used superior mobility and archery to defeat larger armies, extracted tribute from settled states, sometimes established empires that combined nomadic military power with settled administrative structures, and eventually were absorbed into the populations they had conquered or disappeared back into the steppes. This recurring pattern reveals something fundamental about the relationship between different types of societies. Nomadic pastoralism produced relatively small populations but highly effective warriors. Agricultural civilization produced large populations and sophisticated institutions, but often struggled to generate military forces that could match nomadic cavalry in operational mobility and tactical flexibility. Neither system was inherently superior, each had advantages and disadvantages. But at certain historical moments, the nomadic advantage in warfare could translate into political dominance, allowing small numbers of steppe warriors to control or terrorize vastly larger agricultural populations. The reason this pattern eventually ended wasn't that settled civilizations finally figured out perfect counter-tactics. It was that the underlying technological and economic basis of warfare changed. Gunpowder weapons eventually negated the advantages of composite bows and mobility. Disciplined infantry with muskets could defeat cavalry charges. Artillery could destroy fortifications and armies, with a power that arrows couldn't match. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the steppe peoples found themselves at a technological disadvantage, their traditional weapons and tactics obsolete against modern firearms. The last great steppe empire, the Mongols, had already begun this transition in the 13th and 14th centuries, adopting siege engines and gunpowder weapons from Chinese sources. But the fundamental shift came later, when settled societies developed industrial capacity that could produce firearms in quantities and qualities that nomadic peoples couldn't match. Even so, the legacy of steppe warfare persisted in military thought. The emphasis on cavalry, on mobility and speed, on envelopment and encirclement rather than frontal assault, these concepts that steppe peoples had perfected influenced European military doctrine well into the modern era. Napoleon's emphasis on rapid movement and living off the land echoed steppe practices. The German blitzkrieg of World War II, using mechanized forces to achieve breakthrough and encirclement, was in some ways a motorized version of steppe cavalry tactics. The goal remained the same: use speed and mobility to get inside the enemy's decision cycle, strike where unexpected, destroy cohesion before the enemy can respond effectively. For the Huns themselves, if any consciousness of their identity survived their political collapse, the end came not with dramatic final battles but with quiet absorption. Some groups retreated eastward, back toward the steppes from which their ancestors had come. Others remained in Europe, gradually intermarrying with Germanic and Slavic peoples, their distinct identity fading over generations. Their language disappeared, their customs were abandoned or transformed, their very existence eventually became legendary rather than historical. By the medieval period, writers weren't sure if Attila and the Huns had even been real, or were mythological figures like Beowulf and Grendel. The recovery of Hunnic history through archaeology and critical analysis of ancient sources is an ongoing process. Each new discovery, a burial site, a weapon cache, an inscription, adds small pieces to the puzzle. Genetic analysis of skeletal remains from Hun period graves reveals the mixture of populations that made up the Confederation. Isotope analysis of teeth shows migration patterns and dietary changes. Climate studies illuminate the environmental pressures that may have driven Hun movements. Slowly, carefully, scholars are reconstructing a more accurate picture of who the Huns were and what they achieved. What emerges is neither the demonic destroyers of Christian propaganda nor the noble savages of Romantic revision. The Huns were people, complex, adaptive, brutal when brutality served them, pragmatic when pragmatism worked better. They were products of their environment and culture, shaped by the harsh steppes that had formed their ancestors for millennia. They brought to Europe a way of war that Europeans weren't prepared to face, and for a few crucial decades they controlled the battlefield through a combination of superior technology, tactics, and the willingness to use violence on a scale that shocked their enemies. Then, as quickly as they had risen, they fell, victims of their own success, of the death of a crucial leader, and of the fundamental instability of confederations built on plunder and personal loyalty rather than institutions and shared identity. The story of the Huns is ultimately a story about power, its sources, its exercise, and its limits. They achieved extraordinary power through military means but couldn't translate that military dominance into lasting political structures. They terrified Europe but couldn't fundamentally transform it. They defeated Roman armies but couldn't destroy Rome's cultural and religious legacy, which outlasted them by centuries. They controlled battlefields but not the deeper currents of history that would eventually render their way of life obsolete. When steppe warriors controlled the battlefield, they could indeed reshape the political landscape, destroy armies, topple empires. But battlefields aren't history. They're moments within it, and moments pass. The thunder of Hunnic hooves echoed across Europe for less than a century, then faded into silence, leaving behind legends, trauma, and lessons about the nature of warfare that military thinkers would study for the next 1500 years.